Good afternoon, and welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us. Our 2024 annual theme is Waging Peace. This year, we are looking at the many different ways that President Eisenhower worked towards a global peace. This month has been dedicated to discussing refugee relief during the Eisenhower administration. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Kate Hallgren. She is a historian for the United States Citizenship and Immigration History and Library, and she will talk to us about the Hungarian refugee crisis of 1956 to 1958. So, Dr. Hallgren, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to see the people in the live audience, and I think this is a great topic. So I think we'll have a good presentation and discussion today. Shall I go ahead and bring up my slides? Fantastic. I do want to thank the Eisenhower Presidential Library staff who have helped me to be here today and set this up. Samantha and Joy, thank you so much. And Dr. Ginther also answered some of my research questions, so I don't want to neglect them. But the topic is one that's very close to my heart because it touches on so many aspects of this post-war period. It was a real turning point in the Cold War. It was the biggest refugee crisis to follow World War II in Europe, and it started to test some of those cooperative international mechanisms set up after World War II. And the US response created a pattern that many presidential administrations following have decided to study and even to follow that pattern to this day. So we are talking about something with a lot of relevance. Just to introduce myself a little bit, I think this is going to help explain my approach today. So I work at a federal agency called U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services that was founded in 2003, and it handles all immigration applications and petitions. Our predecessor agency is what I'll be talking about a lot today, and that was the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, and that was in place from 1933 to 2003. At that time, it was part of the Department of Justice. So immigration fell under the Department of Justice. Today, it follows under the Department of Homeland Security. So just if I start to talk about the Attorney General, you know, he was even above the INS that was administering some of these refugee programs we'll be discussing. I work at the History Office and Library there as a historian. We provide a lot of public services such as reference questions. On this slide on the left, you see some books that our staff has helped people research and find information for. And in the center, you see a poster for a documentary we created with the National Park Service about Ellis Island. It's a cool documentary. They created it before I joined the staff, but it's still available on YouTube if you're interested. I think it's about 45 minutes. I want to apologize. My slides, some of the photos grew a little bit when I just uploaded them, so they do cover some of the headlines a tiny bit, but I think hopefully you'll still be able to see everything. Let us know if you have any questions about what you see on the slides. But I want to talk about 1956 and the context for this crisis coming out of Hungary. And I want to focus first on the domestic situation. So as you know, fall of 1956 was a presidential campaign with President Eisenhower running for re-election and facing scrutiny over his health because he had a major heart attack the previous year when he was nearly 65 years old. And this image, I like to sort of show that campaign with his image of Vice President Nixon on one side. At the same time as Eisenhower was getting toward the very end of that presidential campaign. His Secretary of State and very close advisor, John Foster Dulles, was also undergoing serious medical treatment. And Eisenhower, in his autobiography, called the last 3 weeks of October 1956, quote, the most crowded and demanding 3 weeks of my entire presidency. In the midst of these domestic goings-on, internationally, the U.S. was trying to manage an escalating conflict in Egypt, the Suez Crisis, which involved control over a waterway essential for bringing oil to Europe and brought a military confrontation between the Egyptian government and Israel, France, and Great Britain. We're not going into a lot of detail on this, but I really want to mention it because it was a major focus for the press and a massive focus for the Eisenhower administration when this conflict rose up. To complicate matters further, in 1956, there were a series of confrontations in Eastern Europe. And we're going to look at this in greater detail because it's causative for what would become the Hungarian refugee crisis. Following the death of Stalin in 1953, Soviet party leadership began to back away from Joseph Stalin's most hardline policies. And in February 1956, first Secretary of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, you see him in that central picture on the right, made a speech denouncing Stalin's so-called cult of personality. In this speech to Communist Party officials, often called the secret speech, he laid out a new future in which the Soviet Union might pursue peaceful coexistence with the West. And on the left here, you see a copy of the secret speech that was translated into Polish. And on the right, you see, jumping ahead a few years, an image of Khrushchev and Eisenhower. Kind of a demonstration of that concept of peaceful coexistence. In the satellite states, or the Eastern Bloc, this led to a period of conflict within the ruling communist parties. This intensified after Khrushchev's speech because although it was called the secret speech, it did leak out. And this created political turmoil. Historians see this period as a time of experimentations, with some local leaders pushing for greater independence from the Soviet Union or liberalization of policies. And this certainly happened in Poland. The images on this slide is from Poland. You see images of a June 1956 uprising of workers who were demanding better conditions. The hardline Polish Communist Party there quickly and violently put down the demonstrations, but they did lead to an October 1956 rise of a more reforming wing of the Communist Party. Now, we're not here to talk about Poland today, but I think this also really helps us understand what's going to happen in Hungary and sets the stage for the refugee crisis. The Hungarian Communist Party was going through similar conflicts. Popular demonstrations were forcing Communist Party leaders to begin to institute reforms and liberalization. The crisis came to a head on October 23, 1956, when students in Budapest demonstrated against Soviet control and demanded the withdrawal of Soviet troops. That day, police fired on demonstrators, but the Hungarian army was reluctant to attack its own people. Soviet troops began to crack down on demonstrators the very next day. Hundreds of people died and were injured. Over the following weeks, it looked as if the Soviet Union might allow Hungary to choose its more liberal communist leader, and thus began to navigate its own form of communism and a degree of independence from the Soviet Union. And the world was really watching with bated breath to see what would happen in Budapest. But then on November 4th, a reported 1,000 Soviet tanks rolled into the city to put down the uprising. Scholars estimate that close to 3,000 Hungarians and 700 Red Army soldiers died in the fighting that finally ended on November 11th with a Soviet declaration of victory. At the time, American newspapers were reporting on this extensively and said that Hungarians were fighting with fists, sticks, and stones while Soviet tanks and soldiers fired on them. They often called the Hungarian demonstrators freedom fighters as well. As you can imagine, the strongly anti-communist American public and press were very sympathetic to the Hungarians. However, the Eisenhower administration decided not roll back Cold War policy. I'm sorry the screen went blank for a moment there. Let me know if I should do anything different technologically. Do you see my slides? I'll go on talking about the humanitarian crisis. There we go. Okay. So a humanitarian crisis arose almost immediately after the conflict started on the streets of Budapest. About 5 days after the fighting broke out, a crying woman walked across the Hungarian border into Austria, where troops greeted her with food and drink. The Austrian government immediately recognized her as a refugee. Her photo ran on the front pages of newspapers across the United States. The exodus of Hungarians had begun. Over the following months, approximately 200,000 people, or 2% of the country's population, left Hungary, and most of them crossed by foot into Austria. While Austria's leaders initially welcomed the Hungarians, they were starting to become overwhelmed. This is a lot of people coming in very quickly over a short period of time. And the Austrian government asked for help resettling the refugees and paying for their care. The United Nations echoed Austria's pleas, and over 20 member states responded, including the United States. This image shows refugees receiving aid in Austria. On the left, a volunteer gives out hot drinks, and on the right, young women sleep in beds, in bunk beds in a refugee camp. US headlines dramatized the needs of the people escaping Hungary, and according to President Eisenhower's memoir, he felt he should do everything possible to help the refugees. On November 2nd, the president pledged $20 million for the housing, food, and care of refugees inside Austria, and his administration began to discuss other ways to help out in this humanitarian crisis. Within a week, US nonprofits, including the American Friends Service Committee and the Church World Service, began to ask the public for medical donations, clothing, bedding, and money to send abroad. And in what some people have called Operation Mercy, a US Air Force airlift transported 189 tons of medical supplies, bedding, and food to Red Cross centers for refugees in Austria, Switzerland, and West Germany. And this took place from November to December 1956. So this is all happening very, very quickly, right? I mean, October 23rd, you have a breakout of fighting. You have October 28th, a woman crossing into Austria with people beginning to stream into Austria. And within a week or two, you have an airlift of supplies going out to parts of Europe adjacent to Hungary. This aircraft, I'm just finding my way here. This example aircraft, the C-119, was one of the type used to transport materials. And I just think it's very interesting because it was called a flying boxcar. And for those of you who are interested in aircraft, you can kind of see on the slide there are two tails. If you see an image of the plane from above, or if it's tilted in the air, you can see that there's a lot of space in there. And it's also used to transport troops. So they were putting a lot of resources into this supply airlift. But critics of the Eisenhower administration and some people within the Eisenhower administration really wanted to do more. to help the refugees more directly. And our allies in Europe were beginning to open borders to welcome refugees as permanent residents. Well, the US wasn't quite there yet. So I include this slide just to list some of the countries that were active in accepting people. These numbers are really come from the end of the crisis. So these numbers were not right away, but it gives us a sense of what was happening to begin the resettlement. On November 8th, approximately 16 days or just over 2 weeks after the fighting first broke out in Hungary, the White House announced it would take 5,000 unused visas for refugees, originally allotted as part of the Refugee Relief Act of 1953, a law created before anyone even imagined this confrontation would take place. And they would take these visas and use them before they expired for Hungarians who had fled to Austria. So this is sort of a creative use of existing immigration law to try to help the refugees get into the country. And I find this very interesting because I work for an agency that works on this type of policy, but hopefully you'll find it interesting too, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the background. This photo shows President Eisenhower and Secretary Dulles. I love it because they're in such serious conversation, and it's a famous photo. You might have seen it before, but they're supposedly talking about the Suez crisis, and they probably are, but it's October 30th, and I wonder if they also might have been talking about the Hungarian refugee crisis and confrontation at that same moment, because it's really all happening at about the same time. So just to go back to the visas and the question of how they were going to be given out, today, historians say that a State Department official, Scott McLeod, came to the Eisenhower administration with the idea for doing this. And Scott McLeod was the Assistant Secretary of State for Consular Affairs. So he really was in charge of all the overseas visas and how they were given out. He's best known today for opposing communism and investigating suspected communists within the State Department, particularly investigations and purges of State Department employees suspected of being gay in what historians call the Lavender Scare. But perhaps due to his strong anti-communism, he was very sympathetic to the Hungarian refugees as well. And his idea was going to have a lot of impact on people's lives and on the course of the Eisenhower administration during this crisis. Following the opening of refugee visas to Hungarians in Austria, the head of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, whose name was Joseph M. Swing, sent employees to Vienna to help the State Department's consular officials process the refugees. And by process, that's sort of a technical term that people used. I don't really like it because it makes people sound like inanimate objects, but processing really means interviewing them, making sure they're eligible, giving them initial paperwork and identification, and helping them move to the next stage of the process, because there are a lot of stages and a lot of aspects necessary before a person can come into the United States. We'll be talking about that more later. So that's why this room is so busy. I love this photograph. In the center, wearing white for the most part, you see the federal employees, such as people who worked at the consulate, Immigration and Naturalization Service employees. They're holding books, they're working at typewriters, they're working on files. And then around them, outside the perimeter of the room, are people from Hungary seeking to come into the United States. And even on the upper left, you can kind of see some bars, and you can see that outside the room, there's even more of a crowd of people. So this photo really demonstrates a lot, because the number of unused visas that could be given to refugees turned out to be a little higher than the estimate of 5,000. It turned out to be 6,100 unused refugee visas. And They were first given out starting on November 19th, and the last one was given out by December 1st. So that means that in just 12 days, 6,100 people got those refugee visas so that they could come into the United States. So very quick work on the part of people who were assigned to work during this crisis. So the INS Commissioner Swing, who you can see on the left of this slide, was actually a former West Point classmate of President Eisenhower's, who also graduated in 1915, and he was also a retired Army general. And in the center of this slide, you see Congressman Francis E. Walter. He's really important to immigration in this time period, and we'll talk about him again later. They traveled together to Austria to visit the refugee camps and to visit the processing and the civil servants who were helping the refugees. This helped to provoke more sympathy for Hungarians. The two reported when they got back that they had seen a Red Army soldier shoot an escaping Hungarian near the Austrian border. They also said that they had observed the work of refugee processing and said that it was going really well, it was effective, it was smooth, and Commissioner Swing actually wanted the Attorney General to expand the program. Representative Walter on the right was a very strongly anti-communist person, and he was actually a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee. He also spoke out to support admitting the refugees into the United States and to support what he called cutting red tape. So these are two very prominent people speaking to the press, supporting the administration's work when they came back from their tour of Eastern Europe. Well, how could the administration actually expand this program? They didn't have any more refugee visas, and immigration law only allows some people to come to the US. So on December 1st, President Eisenhower announced that over 15,000 Hungarian refugees would be brought to the US under a condition called parole. And I try not to have too many text-heavy slides, but I'm going to read this because I think the details are important to understanding the parole issue. And I really didn't understand parole until I began my current job. You may know all about it, but I think it's good to look at the details here. So I'll read this. The Attorney General may, in his discretion, parole into the United States temporarily under such conditions as he may prescribe for emergent reasons or for reasons deemed strictly in the public interest, any alien applying for admission to the United States. This was part of the law that was then in place and had been in place since 1952. So when Eisenhower decided to use parole for the Hungarian refugees, he was breaking with tradition in that he decided to use it for a group of people and not a single person. In granting parole to the Hungarian refugees, I'm calling them refugees, even though at this point they're entering the US under a different status, the status of parole. So if I were an attorney, I might call them parolees, but I'm just going to call them refugees because that's what contemporaries called them. When he decided to use parole, he faced criticism from a lot of different sides of the issue. Some people felt that because a person who was paroled into the US was on a temporary status and they did not get a lawful permanent residence and a green card, they did not get a possibility for applying to citizenship. Those opponents of this program felt he was not going far enough in welcoming Hungarian refugees into the country. And in fact, there were newspaper stories at the time alleging that Catholic charities operating in Austria did not want Hungarian refugees there to come to the US because they saw this temporary status as unsatisfactory. But Eisenhower's administration also faced criticism from people on the opposite side of the issue who felt eventually that too many people were coming into the US under this program. So they made the choice, and they faced a lot of discussion about it in the press. President Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles understood the need to cultivate support for the program. And in early December, they asked Vice President Nixon to go to Austria to help generate positive publicity. Newspapers followed him as he visited refugee camps, and he praised the people he had met. You can see that quote on this slide here. Others in the executive branch also had positive things to say about the Hungarian refugees. The Immigration and Nationality Service, or INS, used statistics pointing out that many of the people coming into the US from Hungary had a high educational level or skilled qualifications for work. They mentioned that many of the people coming in were relatively young, and over half of them were male, which presumably made them easier to place in the labor market. So how are the people going to come in to the US? This is going to be a very complex operation. And it's interesting that for logistics, it rested heavily on both the power and brains of the US military. And this airlift operation was called Operation Safe Haven. It occurred in two phases, Safe Haven 1 and 2. On December 12th, Eisenhower hired Tracy S. Voorhees, an attorney and former Assistant Secretary of the Army, as chairman of the President's Committee for Hungarian Refugee Relief. Voorhees was an expert in what today we would call supply chain management. He had overseen previous food relief and supply missions in Europe after World War II. So to transport the Hungarian refugees to the US, Eisenhower relied on the Navy and the Air Force. The Air Force airlift brought approximately 10,000 refugees from Munich to the US, and chartered commercial airliners flew over 4,000. I want to explain the plane here. This is the plane set aside for President Eisenhower's private use. People call it the sort of first Air Force One, or the predecessor to Air Force One. This is the Columbine, and he did lend this personal aircraft to the airlift of the refugees as well. The efforts also, here are some additional images of the airlift. The busiest day was December 24th, when almost 1,000 refugees flew from Munich to McGuire Air Force Base, and special missions carried high-risk passengers, including infants, the ill and infirm, and women in the late stages of pregnancy. This was the biggest airlift in U.S. history for refugees, and the biggest humanitarian airlift since the Berlin airlift, according to different Air Force historians. There was also a sea lift, and this included ships such as the General George Randall and the General Leroy Elting. The Elting had cabin spaces for 250 families with children and 1,500 bunks for single men. The voyage across the Atlantic to New York took about 2 weeks, and about 9,000 refugees were transported by sea. Helping to emphasize the positive aspects of the refugees, Navy officers told reporters that young Hungarian men on the transport ships had asked how they could help, volunteered to work on board, and even asked how they could join the Navy. Once in the US, the Hungarian refugees traveled to Camp Kilmer, an Army camp built during World War II in central New Jersey. Army quartermaster troops prepared the camp to house, feed, and even entertain the migrants with TV and amateur theatricals. Cooks there prepared meals heavy in calories, up to 4,300 calories per day for each refugee. And this was designed, oh, you can see my dog in the background, sorry. This was designed to counteract food deprivation. And the Army even stockpiled infant formula to feed the youngest escapees. The camp had special facilities set up for required public health inspections and immigration interviews, as well as fingerprinting and photographing. The nearby Newark, New Jersey District Immigration Office reassigned workers to Camp Kilmer to help handle the incoming immigrants and assigned its workers to rotating 8-hour shifts in a 24-hour schedule of duties that included interviews, investigations, legal oversight, records creations, and what managers called myriad incidentals. As the operation continued and thousands of refugees entered the country each day, more East Coast employees of the INS were relocated temporarily to New Jersey to help. And I've also read that this is similar for the Department of Labor. So if you look at the way a person would proceed through those different stages of the migration process, after passing through medical and immigration processes, they would get interviewed by Department of Labor employees to try to match their skills with jobs in the US. That was a big effort for them. Once they passed their interviews, eligible adults received an I-25 identification card from the INS, as well as a Social Security card. And nonprofit sponsors guided them out of the camp and into civilian life. These nonprofits included the National Catholic Welfare Conference, the Church World Service, the United Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and the International Rescue Committee, among others. And these are still many organizations that are active today in working with refugees. The INS Commissioner, Joseph M. Swing, who you saw in a previous slide, recalled that the Hungarian refugee crisis challenged, quote, every operation of the service. And a congressman who visited Camp Kilmer praised federal employees for their dedication and for balancing the need for efficiency with security. This question of efficiency and security, the call for humanitarian activity and security is debated increasingly in January through spring of 1957. In early January, President Eisenhower asked Congress to amend the 1952 immigration law to give the president greater powers to parole refugees into the country and to provide a pathway for people who had already been paroled into the country to achieve a permanent legal status and to apply for citizenship. He also asked for a reform that would have allowed for higher immigration numbers more generally. And this would have made an adjustment to allow more immigrants to come in every year, about 60,000 more immigrants per year, compared to about 160 to 170,000 immigrants per year. So his reform proposal did elicit a lot of opposition at the time, and this may have helped to fuel a backlash against the Hungarian refugee program. His opponents began to cast doubt on the question of whether so many people should be entering the country. By mid-January 1957, a few politicians began to speak out much more negatively about the Hungarian refugee program. One of the first, who you see on the left of this slide, and I showed you this picture earlier, was Congressman Walter. During his earlier trip to Hungary, if you might recall, he had really praised the program, but now he began to warn that communists and spies could be entering the country this way. He even said that he had witnessed refugees tearing up membership cards from the Communist Party, basically saying he had witnessed evidence of subversion attempts. Representative Long of Louisiana, who is pictured in the center here, objected to the growing numbers of Hungarian refugees and the possibility of expanding immigration numbers more generally. He warned audiences that Americans were, quote, almost engulfed by a tide of immigrants, and said the U.S. would, quote, burst at the seams if immigration populations increased. Opposing them were representatives of the Eisenhower administration, as we've seen earlier, but also senators and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt praised the administration's efforts to help refugees learn English, adapt to the U.S., and find work here. She used her newspaper column, My Day, to highlight the contributions of nonprofits who were fundraising on behalf of the refugees. Last, Senator Neuberger, a Democrat from Oregon, and he's not pictured on this slide, pointed out that Canada, which had also accepted about 30 to 40,000 Hungarian refugees, had actually accepted 5 times the proportion on a per capita basis as calculated by population. So he was kind of trying to use this figure to pressure the US to allow more people to enter in the program. In April 1957, President Eisenhower announced that as the humanitarian crisis diminished, or as fewer people were crossing the border into Austria from Hungary, the US would begin to accept fewer Hungarian refugees. While this disappointed some of his supporters, it was in line with public opinion, which had begun to grow more negative toward the program, as shown in Gallup polls. On May 15, 1957, the administration closed Camp Kilmer, and the president dissolved the Committee for Hungarian Refugee Relief. While President Eisenhower officially announced the end of the Hungarian refugee program in December 1957, it had really ceased to operate much earlier. And one estimate of total cost that I've found was about $12 million in 1957 dollars, or about $104 million in today's money, that paid for medical care, job placement, and housing programs. In total, as counted by the Immigration and Naturalization Service in 1958, 38,045 refugees and parolees entered the country from 1956 through 1957. 6,130 of them received the refugee visas, which would allow them to achieve lawful permanent residence with a green card, and if they wished to apply for citizenship, while 31,950 people entered the country on a parole status, which was designed to be temporary. This did not provide lawful permanent residence status with a green card and did exclude them from applying for citizenship. After continuing political battles over immigration reform and a failure of Eisenhower's proposed liberalization of restrictions, in July of 1958, Congress passed a law applying specifically to the Hungarian refugees who had entered the country on parole. And this law allowed them to attain lawful permanent resident status and thus, if they wish, become citizens. As we've seen today, the Hungarian uprising pushed the Eisenhower administration to rapidly create new programs and policies. The metaphor that comes to mind for me is building a plane while they were flying it. Not only did the Eisenhower administration respond creatively with immigration law, for example, by reassigning unused refugee visas and applying the parole clause in a new way, but it also coordinated military, federal civilian, and voluntary agency workers to oversee different aspects of refugee resettlement. In the decades since, other presidential administrations have looked at the Hungarian resettlement program as an example, and they've followed some of the patterns it's established. One example would be the Vietnamese refugee crisis of the late 1970s. And on the left here, you see an image of people evacuated from Vietnam and housed temporarily on a US military base. A more contemporary example would be Operation Allies Welcome, designed to evacuate Afghan nationals, many of whom had worked with US government from 2001 to 2021. And this image on the right shows Afghan children interacting with a nurse on a US military health and hospital center in Germany. I hope that through this deep dive into the Eisenhower administration's Hungarian refugee crisis program, you have a greater understanding of the context surrounding the original use of parole for a large group of people, as well as an appreciation for the far-reaching legacy of decisions made during the Eisenhower presidency. This concludes my presentation for today, but I want to have a chance to listen to questions, participate in discussion, And at the very end, I'll come back to these ideas, but I do have a slide that gives our contact information at the history office and library. This bottom email, we're happy to get any questions you may have. We're happy to get your feedback. We frequently work with people on any questions about immigration or citizenship history. And we do have a web exhibit on refugee law and policy from 1891 to 2003, if you'd like to check it out. So after that little plug for our services, please let me know if you have any questions. I've talked quite a bit. Let me hear from you.
Thank you, Dr. Hallgren. So if anyone has questions, if you've written them down, I'll come get it from you. Or if you just want to stand up and ask, I'll come to you. Yes, no, maybe. Okay, well, I do have one question.
Sure.
You were talking about the parolee provision. Was it those immigrants coming in as a parolee for the general population, were they looked at differently than immigrants who came in with a standard visa?
So all the evidence that I've seen shows that the public and the press really looked at them the same way. The press just called them Hungarian refugees in all the headlines and all of the stories that I've seen. They had more challenging status in that they couldn't be sure if they would be allowed to stay until that 1958 law was passed. So, as far as I know, people just perceived them the same way.
Okay, thank you. Oh, we have a question. Did you hear that?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I did not.
She wanted to know, did most of the Hungarian refugees stay, or did they eventually go back? What happened to them?
That's a great question because some people believed, I think Congressman Walter might have been one of them, that Hungarians would come and then leave again. In fact, most of them stayed that I know of, according to what I've read and settled here. I think there were maybe out of the 38,000, about 100, I think I've read, left between 1956 and 1957. Some of them said they wanted to go back to be with their families. There were a few security concerns that the Immigration and Naturalization Service found. So there were a few people who were sent back as well.
Any other questions? All right, well, there are no other questions in the room and there are no questions online. So if you'd like to give any last comments, Dr. Hallgren?
Well, I hope that, I hope that people just feel really encouraged in digging into these topics because they just have so much bearing on debates taking place today about presidential powers and about immigration. And there's a lot of great information available online and available through organizations such as the Eisenhower Library about some of these questions that people have and people debate so much today. Our library has a lot of information about numbers of people who are coming into the country, where they've settled, and a lot to help people interpret some of these very kind of challenging legal definitions. I know the term parolee can be pretty complicated. So I hope people enjoyed the presentation, take something out of it, and feel free to get in touch with us with any questions you might have. Digging into your own family history is also a really interesting way to learn more about some of these questions about, in many cases, immigration. I've read that some people say 60% of the population today can trace their background through Ellis Island. There are some big statistics there. We're happy to help answer any questions people might have about their family history or immigration. So please stay in touch. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time and for this great presentation. For those of you in the room and who are also watching us online, just a few housekeeping things before we leave, a couple of announcements. First of all, our 2024 programs are brought to you courtesy of the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeff Cope Memorial Foundation. We are certainly appreciative of all that they do. We would not be able to have these programs without them. Our next program is our Evenings at Ease on March 12th at 7 p.m. It is a movie night. The theme for March, or the subject for March, is Radio Free, Radio Liberty, and Radio Europe, rather. And so we are going to watch the movie Freedom Radio. We will be over in the Visitor Center for that. So come and enjoy a free movie and some free popcorn as we watch a movie about the Cold War radio, which also leads us to our Lunch and Learn for March, which is March 28th, here in the courtyard at noon. We will welcome Dr. Mark Pomar, who will be talking to us about Cold War radio. Once again, that is our topic for the month. If you'd like to learn more about us or get on our email list so that you can find out about our programs, just go to our website and you can find us and click on that. And we are happy to send information to you. So thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful, wonderful day.